And we are now live. Kareem, please welcome our audience.
All right. Hi, everybody. First off, I'll just do a quick check on audio if you can hear me okay. Thumbs up by maybe Margaret.
Yeah, it sounds good to me.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining this really amazing session. We are extremely happy to be hosting you today. And I'd like to also thank our partners, SRP and Dragos, for enabling this session. I absolutely love when the ecosystem comes together to share best practices, especially surrounding cybersecurity, a world that moves extremely quickly, and it's amazing to be able to do that today with you. So thank you again for joining, and wishing everybody an amazing session. So if Margaret, you can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'd like to introduce our guest speakers and our keynote speakers today. First off, we'll have Patrick Miller from Empix Cyber. Patrick brings over 35 years of experience in IT and OT and through his consulting services, and has been working on critical infrastructure for a very long time. And it represents basically as a key resource in a lot of the sectors that we'll be discussing today. So thank you, Patrick, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And then we have from Salt River Project, SRP, we'll have Mark Johnson Barbier. Mark is a senior principal analyst at SRP, brings over 20 years of experience as well, responsible for the cybersecurity architecture in the IT and OT systems at SRP. We've been working with Mark and his team very closely during the last few months, as well as Brent Hagen from SRP as well. Brent is a senior principal cybersecurity architect with, again, over 20 years of experience in the utility industry. And, Mark, Brent, and Patrick will be sharing best practices, tips, tricks, what they've experienced in the last few months and even years as the world is transforming very rapidly. We'll share some experiences and also some of the amazing things that we've done together. So again, thank you, Mark, Brent, and Patrick for joining us today and enabling this session together. Thank you. And then from Keysight, we have Myra Salmon. Myra is part of our industry solutions team and leads our best practices and product solutions focusing on the OT and IT. And Myra's been with Keysight for a very long time and works with customers on challenges and defining our products as one our go-to-market strategy when it comes to IT and OT visibility and security. And Peter Valenzuela, Senior Solutions Architect with Dragos, has been a close partner of ours during this deployment with SRP, and they will both be sharing some of the things that we've been working on with SRP as well. And then moving on to the agenda, the welcome is happening right now with me. By the way, I didn't introduce myself. I'll do that rapidly. I forgot. My name is Kareem Lakas. I am head of sales and operations for Keysight in North America, and I work with an amazing team of SEs and account managers deployed in Canada and the US. And we work with many customers, including utilities, on securing their network. And that is a little bit about me. But going on with the agenda, we'll have an updates on the NERC CIP and National Cybersecurity Strategy. So Patrick will basically provide an update on that. We'll have a Q&A session. We'll then move into implementing east-west traffic visibility for physical and virtual infrastructure. And Mark and Brent will discuss what they've done with the SRP environment and how Dragos and Keysight have come together to help SRP deliver this visibility. We'll talk about the use cases, and we'll have some questions for the audience as well. And Myra and Peter will be driving this. And then finally, we'll have an open roundtable discussion. If you have some questions or you'd like to discuss some of the challenges that you're having, we can absolutely review that together. Okay. During the presentation, we'll have questions, we'll have polls, and we'll have an open discussion. So for the polls, a pop-up window will basically pop up, and then you can move it around, make your selection, and then press submit, and then you'll have the scores in real time. So again, it's going to pop up in the middle of the presentation. You can either move it around, wait for the section to finish, and then enter your results, or just enter them right away. If you have some questions under the chat, which is basically on the right side, You can basically enter your questions in there, and we'll have someone monitoring the chat so they can answer this in live or after the discussion. And then you can raise your hand at the bottom of the screen here, and if you have a questions, we'll basically unmute you, and you can ask your question during that time. So again, thank you very much, everybody, for joining. A big thanks to SRP for enabling this discussion, and we are super energized by this discussion. Thank you again. Cheers.
All right. Hi, all. I'm Patrick Miller, and I'm going to talk about NERC-CIP and the National Cybersecurity Strategy. We'll kick things off. And since I'm not driving, I'm going to say next slide for my driver. All right. This is my bio and why I supposedly know what I'm talking about. I am the CEO of Apex Cyber. I've done lots of different consulting firms. This is the latest one. I test well. I was one of the first architects of the NERC-CIP standards way back in late 2001, early 2002, and was the actual first NERC-CIP auditor in the country. I've been doing this for a very long time. Some DOE projects and some other things in the middle there. Next slide, please. Apex Cyber, we do consulting in the OT and ICS space, and definitely a lot of regulatory. We keep you ahead of your adversaries and your auditors. Next slide, please. Okay. This is what we're going to talk about today. This is the most important part of the meat here. We're going to talk about the NERC-CIP trajectory. I'm not going to go over too much, at least the history of NERC-CIP and where it was and where it's been and where it started. We're going to talk about where it's going. And then we'll talk about the National Cybersecurity Strategy. And then I'm going to include a little bit on the National Security Memoranda, plural. There's been a couple that are, it's been a bunch of them, but a couple that are specific to this sector and this content. Next slide. Okay, so where are the CIP standards right now? Where is the existing body of standards? So I've got the list here, 2 through 14. We won't talk about CIP 1. It doesn't exist anymore. It was essentially moved into a different standard. So 2 through 14, these are the existing ones. And just to walk you through the logic behind these for those that are new to CIP or not as versed in CIP. The CIP 2, that's the system categorization. This is where you scope your things. This tells you what's in scope that the standards apply to. CIP 3 is the governance of the whole body, right, of the program. You've got policy in place, you've got an owner of the program, a CIP senior manager, and then some frequencies for when you update those governance elements. CIP 4, this is who has access to the environment. It's about the personnel. Are they trained? Do they have awareness? Should they have access? And when they don't need access, how that access is removed. CIP 6, CIP 5, this is the electronic security perimeter. Basically, think of it like a firewall around all the important things that you scoped in CIP 2. And CIP 6 is the physical protection around all the things that you put inside the firewall that you scoped in CIP 2. And CIP 7 is when you secure all the things inside. Those are the actual devices themselves. So this is going to be your EMS servers, your HMIs. It's going to be RTUs and relays, this kind of thing, for example, in substations and gen plants. This is the actual devices themselves and how you secure them. CIP 8, in the event that things go really bad, how do you respond to an incident? How frequently do you test your response plans, and then updating those plans? Similar thing with 9, if the incident gets bad enough, it becomes a recovery state. Have you tested your recovery plans? What does your recovery plan look like? Do you even have backups? And then CIP 10, this is when the standards shifted a long time ago, back in what we call the version 3 to version 5 effort. These are the new ones, essentially, 10 through 14. And in 10, this is really a breakout of what used to be in CIP 7. It focuses just on configuration change management and vulnerability assessments. So are you managing change, and are you assessing the environment on a regular basis? CIP 11 is protection of the information. So the information about those critical elements that we decided were in CIP 2, how do you protect the information about them so that bad people can't use that information against you? CIP 12 is communicating between control centers. So when one control center communicates with another control center, is that communication protected, encrypted, for example? And then CIP 13 is supply chain. It's what it sounds like. They're very concerned about, obviously, things that would come in via hardware, software, or services into your environment. Are you assessing that risk? And CIP 14 is a recent add-on after a really important substation was shot up in a very surgical way so that we've now got some protections for really important transmission substations. All right, next slide. Some recent standards that we'll say not just happened, but in the speed of the standards. Many of them are in flux, and we'll talk about what that means, but these are the most recent ones that have changed kind of in, I guess we'll say recent history, back to 2022. SIP 4 and SIP 11 were the most recent ones. January of this year, its project number was 2019-02. If you want to go look that up, you can put that into Google and it'll come back with the effort and the history and all the work that went into it, which can be a really good read if you're trying to understand how to implement this. This one was focusing basically on that information we talked about in SIP 11, that information about your critical assets and critical systems, how to move that information to the cloud, because in some cases it's becoming less and less of an option to try to keep all of this on premise, and things like Office 365 and Salesforce and so many other of our tools are becoming cloud-based that in order to use them, we had to have some options. So these are the most recent ones. They are effective and you should be doing them now. So if you're not, go take a look at this and get busy. And the one before that was basically what we call the supply chain security set. And it were some changes to SIP 5, SIP 10, and SIP 13 around tightening up some of this supply chain security elements that were requested by FERC, which is the body that oversees NERC. And if you want to read more about that, check out Project 2019-03. That was effective in October of 2022. All right, next slide. This is the future. So this is, you can see on the bottom, the last bullet there, the board adopted this one on May 9th of 2024. So what does it mean to be board adopted? This basically means that NERC board, kind of the, we'll say the middle tier regulator for the electric sector, they adopted this. So the industry writes the standards with input from the industry itself, in some cases the regulators, in some cases the vendors, but everyone comes together and writes the standards. Those get approved by the industry, and then the industry board, which is effectively NERC, approves that. Once that happens, it goes to FERC. FERC is the actual body that makes it law and makes it enforceable. So it's not at that stage yet. It's on FERC's desk. It's waiting to go through, and FERC just finally got a full complement of commissioners. So there's a chance that at some point in the not too distant future, we'll know exactly what the implementation date is. But that's where this one is now. It's approved. It's on FERC's desk. Once FERC approves it, we'll know kind of what the implementation plan looks like. We'll talk about that in the next slide a little bit. But virtualization is, we've been working on this one for quite some time. It's gone through, I want to say, like 6 rounds of drafting and voting. This is what it sounds like. It's basically to somehow create a method where we can have virtualized assets. We're still working on, some of the cloud components and this kind of thing. And I know, things like your critical systems in the cloud might freak some out, but this isn't too far off in the distant future. There are some unregulated utilities that are actually already doing this. So it's coming our way. But we needed a method to do this. And you can see there the standards affected there on that second to last bullet. It literally changed all of the standards. It affected every single one of them. So this is a landslide of a shift. It's an avalanche of change. Next slide, please. So what did change? As I mentioned, every reliability standard, every SIP standard did change. Some of the key ones that come out. SIP 5 changed the protections of what are known as shared cyber infrastructure. And you can see at the bottom, there were some new terms that were created. And in the SIP standards, if you don't know already, check out the glossary terms. It means as much as the regulation does, because these are official regulated terms. They have very specific, mostly specific meanings in most cases. So when these terms change, this is a very big deal. So we created a new term called shared cyber infrastructure. And you can kind of see how that works with virtualization for things like virtualized firewalls, hosts, and other systems where you've got kind of a, we'll call it loosely a container that holds a bunch of virtual objects inside. We needed a way to show that this was a shared cyber infrastructure with all of those different types of assets. And then things like technical concepts that have some pretty specific details around things like affinity rules and how those assets relate to each other within the virtualized space. So given that this is the direction of where most things are going, we had to try to find a way to regulate this with some specific language that still allows for technology to grow and change and not have to rewrite these standards, every 6 months or a year. So that's why these kind of, or they seem like generalized terms, they are on purpose. Some changes to SIP 7. This specifies the segmentation of systems within that shared cyber infrastructure. And you have to assess the risk, of course, of if you were to escape the hypervisor of any system and how that might affect the neighboring systems or host environments, and similar techniques that are currently, as we see with some of our, frankly, a lot of our current more advanced adversaries, this is becoming the target of choice. So some of the new definitions, we actually define things like cyber system, a management interface. This is important. And then, of course, shared cyber infrastructure and virtual cyber asset. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the future, SIP 2, this is the one that we talked about. This is your scoping environment. This is how you determine what's actually in scope for the standards. At the top bullet, I've got this one as a high priority. This means it's got active drafting teams working on it right now. The industry has been asking for these changes. There is the Standards Committee, which is a committee within NERC. It's made up of the utilities. They've tasked this project. If you want to hear about what's happening to the scope, check out project 2021-03. You can, like I said, you can Google that and it'll take you directly to the project page and you can look up the history. This one is focusing on transmission owner control centers. This is for transmission owners. These are organizations that own transmission lines, but don't necessarily operate it. And if they've got a specific control center, since they're not operating it, there's a request to have some differentiation around how the standards apply to them, because they're not actually operating the facilities. They just happen to be the owner of the facility. Okay, SIP 2 and SIP 14. SIP 14, as I mentioned, it's those critical substations, those critical transmission substations. This is to align the risk assessment component around how you determine what's critical for SIP 2 and also what's critical for SIP 14 to make sure that if there are if there is deviation between those two lists, that's got some logic behind it, or if it's even allowed. And then the SAR, which is the standards authorization request, was really just for requirement 1, parts 1 through 1.1.3. This is the kind of the first step in determining what's critical. And then it does include the identification of certain cyber assets. And then there's some, again, direct revision of criterion 1.3 for those that are standards folks that have been in this for a while. The draft 2, it's gone through, this is its second round of draft. It did not pass on May 16th of this year, so it's back in draft for now. It's back under discussion. All right, next slide. Okay, SIP 8. This one's, again, in draft. It's the future standards. This one's 2022-05. This one's a low priority. It's not getting really much action in terms of drafting. I've been checking in on the drafting teams there, and most of this has gone untouched for a significant amount of time, maybe 6 months or more. It was a result of a study done in Q3 of 2021. So this has kind of been in stasis for a while. And there's a definition in SIP 8 that you've got to report things called attempts to compromise. The standard doesn't speak to this directly, it just uses these terms. So the industry and basically FERC have asked for more clarity around what this means so that we can get some uniformity in what attempts means. And this one is still in draft 1. We haven't seen a draft yet to review. Next slide, please. This one, SIP 15, the Internal Network Security Monitoring. It's INSM, and this one's 2023-03. This one is key, especially for Keysight. This one is a significant change. It's a new standard created. Basically, a study came out from FERC, or an order came out from FERC, as well as similar studies that surrounded it on how it affects low-impact systems and other information provided back to FERC. But the result of this was basically the standards cover a lot of protection for these systems. What FERC thinks the missing gap is, since you've got protections basically at the electronic boundary, the physical boundary, you've got requirements of things like malicious code protections at the boundary, malicious code protections at the system level. There's all these additional account protections. All of that's there. The missing piece was basically inspecting the communication between two systems inside that protected perimeter. And this is important because we're seeing techniques, Fault Typhoon being one of the poster examples recently, that these systems, or these adversaries have learned how to live off the land, which basically means they're not dropping malicious payloads that would get detected by your tools. They're using the systems in ways that would otherwise be normally allowed, would look like normal traffic, to do malicious things. So this is done through various means, whether it's exploitation of existing high access level credentials. So even things like privilege escalation wouldn't be detected. But this is to try to pick up on some of those more sophisticated adversaries if they're in the environment, to inspect the traffic between two systems or all systems inside the area that are of higher risk, so that you know that there's something happening there. This one, the board adopted it on May 9th of 2024. So like the previous one, this is sitting on FERC's desk, waiting for an effective date. Okay, the implementation plan on this one. Once adopted by FERC and they give us an implementation date, there'll be 36 months for high and medium control centers. And then all other medium BES assets, you get 60 months to implement this. And that is, control centers are significantly easier to do this work in. There's often, high availability environments and many other things that, you definitely don't want to just go adding software and adding changes into these environments, without very strict controls and very strict change management. But this at least allows us a little more time to get this done. And then, of course, the field equipment, the other medium assets, this is going to be if you've got a medium generation plant or medium transmission substations, you get more time because in some cases, in particular things like generation, you may only have very specified outage windows, scheduled outage windows over X number of years, like per unit pair. This gives you the time to do that accordingly without having to kind of upend your environment or, in theory, cause outages in the process of trying to prevent outages, for example. So the requirements of SIP 15 are internal network security monitoring, collect network data feeds, detect that anomalous network activity between those systems inside the protected zone, then evaluate the detections that you've picked up on, the anomalous network activity, to determine whether you should do something about that. And then, of course, retain that data and protect that data. Retaining it is so that you can actually do after-the-fact investigations. In some cases, your adversary may have been living off the land for a while and you didn't pick them up until now. You need to at least try to go back and reconstruct some things to see maybe how it happened or what you can do to stop the entry point, exfil point. And then, of course, to protect that data so that your adversary cannot modify that data and cover their tracks. That's really what it comes down to. Okay, next slide, thank you. This one is a future standard, SIP 3. This is really the low impact standards by and large. And then, of course, it also contains the policy and governance for the rest of the medium and high impact. But for this one, this was a result of what's called the low impact criteria review team. I was helping with that team as well. This one basically looks to add controls to authenticate remote users and then protect the authentication information in transit, detect malicious comms, all of these things around the low impact BES cyber systems. So this would be a new requirement for low impact, but only the low impact systems that have what's called external routable connectivity. Basically, we'll say loosely communicating IP through a firewall or protection device at the boundary. Pardon me. Draft 2 ballot didn't pass on Thursday, March 14th of this year. So this one is back in draft right now. And if you want to see what's happening in the drafts, you can take a look at Project 2023-04. Next slide, please. All right. In SIP 14, this is the physical protection one around, as I mentioned, some of those critical substations, critical transmission substations in particular. 2023-06, if you want to see what's happening there. This was a recent, fairly recent, at least in December 2022, to adjust this standard to basically bring in some more protection. This kind of assess if you should add some more protections in SIP 14. It does align with the SIP 2, as I mentioned, in terms of aligning the risk assessments between those two different standards. Draft 1 right now is in 45-day comment. It expires on July 3rd. So if you want to comment on this one, by all means, I would say get moving because time is short. But you'll see a lot more kind of reactive physical security elements coming out. As you may remember, and not too long ago, there were a bunch of distribution. And I say distribution, it's specific because most distribution isn't regulated by NERC or FERC or any federal structures. It's usually handled by the state or local authorities. But even still, if we know that there's, for example, attacking a bunch of distribution, then it's a logical step to say, why aren't they, next going for something more important? For example, the high voltage transmission system, for example. For those that don't know, generation, of course, is where power comes on the wire. Transmission is getting it from generation to distribution. Distribution is that last mile, cities, industrial complexes, these kinds of things. Kind of the three elements in the power system. All right, next slide, please. Okay, that's the SIP standards. Oh, I got a real quick question. Eric, when do we expect virtualization to be fully approved? You know, I'm not sure. I wish I had a better answer. This one is on FERC's desk, so it's gonna happen at their pace. So we don't really know. FERC can three options with FERC. FERC can basically say we don't like it, and no. They can remand the standard, is what it's called. They can adopt it as written and then order changes. So they can say we like it enough to let it pass, but we also want you to change these things within this time frame. Or they can just accept it and say, great, move forward as is. Historically, there have been very few remands. I can think of one, maybe two. I know RFI primarily. They haven't remanded standards directly. They've remanded some other elements. They've almost always accept them with ordered changes. And then there's been a few that they've just accepted that said, great, this is good enough, just move forward. And then later on, other things happen, technology changes or threats change, and then they have to change the standards to adapt. But in this case, this has been long coming. I would expect, FERC to move fairly quickly now that they've got a full complement of commissioners. So I wish I had a better answer. We always, FERC is kind of a black box. We don't really know what goes on from the outside. And that there's good reason for that, is they need to have full independence so that they're free of influence, and they can be, basically when they're done, they can be transparent about how things happen. But in process, they have to evaluate all risks. They take a look at various, intelligence briefings and many other things in terms of what they use to determine their positions. So, in deference to them, I don't know yet. We'll have to see. So pay attention to FERC output. FERC meetings happen every third Thursday of the month. And now that they've got a full complement, we should start seeing some traction in terms of things coming out of the office.
Hey, Patrick, do you mind if I ask you a question live? This is Martin.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that they can remand with orders. What's the chance that they would do that to SIP 15, which is the one that we're talking about mostly now, like that FERC would go change something over and above the draft?
Yeah. Well, if they remand, typically they remand and issue an order, or they'll remand directly and then follow it up with a notice of public rulemaking or a NOPR, which basically says we don't like it, start over. And here's where we want you to start over. That would be like remand with NOPR. Or just remand, like no, just the answer is no. That's a remand with no response beyond just a remand. Typically what they do though is they adopt with orders. So they'll say, we like it enough, but we want you to change these things within X amount of time. And sometimes they can do that within like 90 days or 180 days. So, they're not particularly flexible on the changes, unless it's like a systemic or structural shift in the way everything is done in that standard. But if they want you to change some timelines or change some other minor language, they can go as low as 90 to 180 days. So in terms of probabilities, honestly, Mark, I'd say fairly high. I just think that given their, not that the standard was written poorly, I want to make sure that's clear. It's just they have a very strong, kind of precedent and history set where they rarely just say, we like it, move forward. They always have something to come back with and want some changes. So just given the sheer numbers and probability of how that's kind of unfolded historically, high likelihood.
Okay. And is it possible that they come back and say, here is the new rule, and just write it in and it doesn't go for public rulemaking or comment from industry, or will it always go back for industry comment?
Great question. Actually, they're forbidden from doing that. So they can't just draft up their own law and order it. It has to come up through the standards development process. This is the way the ERO was created under Section 215 of the Energy Policy Act of 2005. So for those that are, legal nerds and you want to go look at the CFRs, it is Section 215 of the 2005 Energy Policy Act. But this is what created the ERO, or Electric Reliability Organization, that NERC has applied for and been basically accepted as the ERO. And then FERC directs the ERO to take certain actions. The ERO takes those actions, brings them back to FERC for approval. Only those actions that have gone through that process can come, or they can bubble straight up from the industry. The FERC doesn't have to direct them. The industry can just say, hey, we want to do this. And then FERC can say basically yes or no. but they cannot directly write the legislation or regulation for the industry in this space alone. They can in other areas, right? They have authority in a lot of other places, just not in the reliability standards, the O&P and SIP standards.
Cool. Thank you.
You bet. Yeah. Great question, too. Okay. And on to the National Cybersecurity Strategy. Sorry, back one slide. There we go. Okay. So the National Cybersecurity Strategy, really historically has been more of a kind of a positioning. It hasn't really contained a lot of meat, frankly. It hasn't really been that actionable. It's been kind of, hey, that way is north. We'd really like everyone to look that way north and maybe think about moving this direction. This is one of the first ones I've seen that actually had real concrete component. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of these, but I was actually a fan of this one. This one was really well written, very thought out, timely, addressed real issues with real responses, by and large. Not perfect by any stretch, but it was orders of magnitude better than any other one I've ever seen. So the pillars in this strategy, of course, are rebalancing responsibility, basically trying to shift the burden of risk instead of on the end consumer to basically read the terms of service and somehow protect themselves from things like 12 armed terrorist nation states armed with far more people, money, and time than your average consumer could ever imagine. To shift that out to those areas where they have much more resources to protect the greater good. Long-term investments, this is trying to get organizations to think less about short-term gains and trying to build more long-term strategic approaches versus short-term band-aid fixes. Go back and think about things like entire code rewrites with memory-safe languages and things like that. Things that are costly but have a much longer-term benefit for both cost, viability, reliability, and general protection in cyberspace in America. Collaboration, always out there, right? Everyone should be collaborating. It's difficult in cyber because no one wants to share the details, whether you've been hacked or how you got hacked or what happened. And it's a touchy subject and there's not a lot of collaboration. So they're just trying to remind people that this is still a good thing. Share what you can when you can. And then the requirements, changing the requirements, for example, to actually meet the need. So we've got a patchwork of regulations. There used to be some in chemical, like will be again called CFATs. There's some in maritime and TSA. There's some in healthcare. There's some in finance. There's some in the gas space, the TSASDs, and then NERC-CIP for the electric sector. They're all so different that they need to be harmonized or in some way at least, aligned so that we can take a look across the landscape of the critical infrastructures and say, where are we, right? How do we understand where they all are against each other and are they in an adequate place? And what was interesting about this is where they're not, we should be creating regulation to make sure that they are. So you're seeing a lot of traction on like possible regulation in the water sector and bringing back the stuff for chemical. That stems from this pillar. And then of course the strategic plan. This basically outlines how the government is supposed to work with private sector, because when you direct a national cyber strategy, the president can only direct the government components. They can't direct citizens and businesses, private organizations to do anything. So this is to direct the government to be more open and collaborative and help the greater good by using some of the great things that the government will be doing. Okay, next slide. This is the key part. Most of these strategies don't come with much in terms of, agency X do Y thing, agency A do B thing, and within C timeframe. This implementation plan is the most specific one I've ever seen. It actually directs specific agencies to take specific action within specific timeframes. And we've already seen some of the products out of this. Most recently, the OECD, the second bullet there, on the harmonization of regulations. They've done some studies and come back and have issued some immediate kind of tactical moves and some strategic alignment over time. So you're already starting to see some of this traction happen. I would say this is easily the most traction I've seen out of any cybersecurity strategy, purely because of this implementation plan. If you're curious about this, you can literally Google the National Cybersecurity Strategy Implementation Plan, and it'll pop right up. So it's rather interesting to look at the kind of, if you were to map it out on a project plan, it's very extensive and very involved. Okay, next slide. So I want to leave us on a couple of other things. So the strategy is important and it does a lot of really good things and it mobilizes elements of the government by, the president can actually order elements of the government to do things and take action. And that's been done and they're being held accountable to a plan to get there. So in addition to things like a national cyber strategy that contains actionable items for agencies within timelines, there's also been a couple of national security memoranda issued. And these memos, they're key because they basically direct elements of the government to do things. There was one on July 28th of 2021 and April 30th of 2024, basically kind of like a revision or update. The first one was improving cybersecurity for critical infrastructure control systems. So this is key. I'm in the industrial space for probably 99% of my work. And for us, we've never seen anything like this, right? This was the first time a presidential document came out and spoke specifically to the industrial control systems that underpin the critical infrastructure of the country. And what the federal government should be doing in its role and capacity to assist. And then, of course, the same thing came out, same thing, but a similar approach and an update came out in April 30th of 2024. Some things kind of echoing the previous one, some new additions, but this was really to just say, hey, we're still serious about this. This is still a front burner issue. So continue to take this seriously. Okay, next slide. All right, this is how you can reach me. If you have any additional questions you don't feel comfortable asking here, you can certainly hit me directly anywhere. I'm ridiculously easy to find. And I don't see any questions in the chat, but I'm certainly happy to answer any, even if we've got some from our fellow panelists, of course.
I'll take advantage for another question. There's so many changes. One of the things that I've always followed and haven't had a chance to look at is the remote access protocol break. Have any of these new standards made any changes with respect to needing that quote unquote protocol break for remote access and jump servers?
None of them have spoke specifically to a protocol break, but they are definitely focusing on remote access. At a minimum, it kind of tiers out. It usually starts with you must at least have multi-factor, right, at the boundary. That's the most minimal protections you can have. First, a boundary, right? Keep your critical stuff off the internet is like step one. And then separate your critical stuff from anything else, business networks or other networks. Once you create those separations, then you need to have some way to remotely access. Do that with multi-factor authentication. That's kind of your minimum kind of set that I see in and remember, first round regulations kind of they can't just come and go like 0 to 60. They got to stage you in and allow you to grow, because anyone who deals with industrial control systems, you can't just turn these things on a dime. You got to build things in. You got to adjust budgets. You got to adjust scheduled outages. So it just by the nature of the way these systems work and physics, we have to allow these kinds of changes over time. So that's typically where we see the start. And then after that, we see requirements of things like a jump host, which often with the jump host, there's at minimum the implication that you're doing a protocol break, or if not the direct requirement, like, at least in NERC CIP, it doesn't explicitly require a protocol break, but it is by far the most common method. Like short of SSH, there's a protocol break.
Right. So
that's the most common. What I am seeing increasingly discussed and likely will find its way soon into regulations, and this is, I got to say, probably 90% influenced by Colonial Pipeline, is the concept of intelligent islanding, so that you know the dependencies between your critical systems and any other system, whether it's an IT system or a business partner system or any other system, so that you know those dependencies, and then you can begin to kind of shear off, lesser important networks and ways to operate in a kind of a manual or limp along way with a locked down environment that's, got broken connections to all the things that are not absolutely critical, so that you can still continue to operate. So this concept of intelligently islanding off your important stuff is getting much, much more airtime, and I can definitely see it coming soon to a regulation near you.
Yeah, we've been talking about that quite a bit. We affectionately refer to it as DEFCON levels. Instead of like a full disconnect, you do an ordered, let's make things harder. Let's shut down firewall rules. So you go from DEFCON 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 before you get to a full disconnect. So
yeah,
intelligent islanding might be a better way to describe that.
I think it was, I want to say it was either maybe MIT or Stanford. There was some academic paper that used that term, and it's been reused. But I think my favorite one is from Mark Bristow. He calls it turtle mode. You just clamp down the shell, wait for the danger to pass, and peek out and see if things are okay.
Yep. like it. Cool, thanks.
Sure.
Well, seeing that we don't have any other questions in the chat, why don't we go on to Mark and Brent, your presentation portion, putting some of what Patrick covered in action.
Yep.
Perfect, let's do it.
All right, getting everything set up here. All right, cool. All right, yeah, thanks. Thanks for letting us come and share some of the things that Mark and I get excited about. So let me give a quick little introduction. So Mark and I are the cybersecurity architects for SRP, or at least 2 of the 4. We do have a couple other folks that focus on some of the other areas, but Mark and I are heavily focused on OT security, OT technology projects, and especially internal network security monitoring for OT is a topic very near and dear to our hearts for the last few years. And I don't know that he'll mention it or not, but Mark was part of the drafting team committee for CIP 15. So definitely had a lot of things to add to that. So you can say all the good things came from Mark, and things you don't like, you can blame other people. Right?
I like
all
that.
Right.
Let's go with that, Brent. Let's do it.
We'll go with that. Yeah. All right. So about SRP, if you don't know who SRP is, so SRP is a power and water utility in Central Arizona. We are one of the nation's largest public power utilities, providing sustainable, affordable, and reliable water and power to more than 2 million people. So obviously, very important topics in a desert that we live. So, okay. Moving on here, so the goal today is we're gonna share a little bit about our aggregation journey, share a little bit about what we've learned about our sensors and sensor deployments, and specifically in relation to the CIP 15 INSM standard. Take a look at what, if you're starting the journey from scratch, maybe we can help share a little bit of our knowledge about how we would approach things now. And you might see that a poll just popped up for you here. We want to keep you all engaged. So the first question here is, do you all have an aggregation or visibility layer in place for your OT environment right now? So if you wouldn't mind taking a second, you can answer that. And I'm gonna go ahead and pass it over to Mark to kick off our
Perfect. We'll start talking.
Yeah, right slide. Here we go.
I've already asked a few questions. The background I had with Patrick was I once met with lawyers before our first audit, and they were telling us about these people from WEC who were coming in, and they showed up, and it was Patrick Miller, and I was like, this guy seems pretty good. So Patrick is the face of CIP for me. Every time I think of CIP, it's like literally the face, because that's how it was introduced. So Brent and I, like you said, we've started on this aggregation 6 years ago, doing an INSM system and trying to figure out how it is that we're going to build it. And I'm going to see if I can monitor the poll. Do we get any results on that? I don't see them.
So yeah, no, it
doesn't give the results.
Yeah, so it looks like we're about halfway. People have an aggregation or visibility layer in place. We got about 20% that know, and the rest it's a work in progress, which we completely get.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and it will be a long work in progress. So we're going to cover essentially where we started from in terms of what we thought, how it was going to be to go find that evil squirrel that's in the network, right? We're looking for the evil things that happen in the network. So we made some initial assumptions when we started working on this. We got a directive from our board of directors and justification and all that sort of stuff to go out and build monitoring in our OT networks. And when we went into this, we went in with some assumptions that turned out to be incorrect. So first of all, we didn't think we needed aggregation. We didn't think that was going to be a thing for us. We looked at the sensors for all the vendors we were looking at. All of them had 4+ ports. Some of them, we thought we needed more. Give us, 6 or 8. That's going to be plenty. And that was one of the assumptions we made. That has an X next to it because it turned out to be wrong. All of the sensors have a capability for deduplication, but I don't think that anybody realized how much we were going to see. So that turned out to be an incorrect assumption. We figured we could do filtering based on VLANs and ports. And the initial plant we went into, we chose the specific ports that we needed. That one's connected to a controller, that one's connected to an HMI. Let's grab that traffic and feed it into our INSM system. And It didn't give us a lot of capability for filtering, and that turned out to be a problem. And then the other thing that we really didn't catch in any of the testing or early things that we did was the level of port failures in the monitoring, and how important that is to make sure that once you're connecting to that data, you don't want to be in a situation where you put it in place and it's there, and then right before the audit comes up, you look at it and say, oh, that one failed, and how long has it been failed for, right? So that became more important to us over time as we've done this. We did make a couple other assumptions that proved to be correct. So you'll see there in the diagram, we ran all those pink cables into a site sensor, and we knew that there were going to be situations that we wanted to have full PCAP. We thought it would probably be, let's take a laptop out and gather some full PCAPs temporarily, or maybe we can get some of it from the sensor. It turned out to be a little more important than we thought, to have multiple tools that we could feed with this system. And we definitely wanted INSM outside of the ISP. A lot of that had to do with not understanding or knowing where the SIP standards were going to go. And I think moving it outside of the ESP turned out to be the correct answer. So we went out and bought a pretty low-end aggregation system. We used a network vendor for it, and we put it in so that we could get the multiple feeds out of that aggregator. Now, we put it in initially, and we said, let's plug into the core switch. That's the obvious true thing to go. I just see a poll pop up. Spans are sufficient for visibility. So yeah, if you want to look at that, is span sufficient for visibility in your organization? We'll definitely talk about that. That'll come up with Brent's presentation as well. When we plugged our aggregator into the core switch, we got a lot of visibility right off the bat, just looking at a core. Now, it's not all the networks are going to have an exact core distribution layer, access layer, right? They're not all perfectly designed like that. But usually there's a core something, and just plugging into that gave us a lot of data. But one of the things we learned when we plugged in is that we needed to work on that aggregator, and the level of effort to build and install it was significant. It was a lot higher than we wanted with our previous vendor. We knew that it wouldn't be something we wanted to turn over to our security operations center because it would take so much time for them to manage and do. So we knew relatively early that we're going to have to find a solution for that one. Other problems that we saw was that measuring the utilization on the ports was difficult. This is all command line interface that we had early on. And just looking at that, it's possible to see it, but you end up doing, show me the port stats, waiting a little bit, show me more port stats, or trying to connect it to a like an SNMP monitoring system, which we couldn't do because these are out in the middle of nowhere in a plant, and we didn't have network access into that system. One of the other things that we didn't anticipate was the level of capacity that was needed in some of these networks. That there are some 10 gig networks out there. Most of the problem that we had was with 100 meg networks, then trying to get those 100 meg connections to actually work on a new switch. That tended to be a problem as well. But there were some pretty high capacity networks, especially the backup and the other networks. And the level of capacity that we started seeing surprised us, to be frank. And a relatively new one that's come along is we've gone out and started virtualizing some of our critical infrastructure, is getting data out of that virtual system into a physical system for aggregation. That's the way we implemented it first. We didn't do the virtual sensors out at the beginning, but that's a problem that we needed to deal with. The wins that we got on the initial system was that we realized, hey, we're plugging into a lot of switches, and having that capacity on the aggregator was important. We used a lot more ports than we thought we would. And the compliance wins, and I mean, obviously it hasn't started yet, but not being in the ESP, I call it a compliance win because we haven't had to do much, right? It's no talking to our compliance people and going through the compliance rigmarole with this whole system, because this is connected without ERC. So once we started realizing that there were problems here that needed to be fixed, we went and talked to our corporate team and said, what are you guys using for your network aggregation? And they had done a bake-off and a big evaluation, and they had selected Keysight. So it was a pretty easy decision for us to start looking at that in the OT networks. And right off the bat, we noticed some huge improvements. So it was a heck of a lot easier to use, right? And literally, we had a meeting, and some of the people are on the call. They looked at the meeting, and it was drop dead simple. And the 1 hour meeting, I think everybody was like, in 15 minutes, yeah, we can manage this. It's not going to be a big problem. The other thing that I really liked about it is that you can go into that interface, and if you've got 4 switches, as is shown here in the diagram, I can say, show me the feeds just from switch 2 and 4. And I can pull one of them out and see exactly the traffic that's not there or exactly what's in one feed. So if I need to look at something and feed it somewhere, that's really easy to go help me identify what's the right place to go look at when I'm connecting into an OT network. The deduplication was huge. In a process control network, especially the generation plants, we're seeing upwards of 90%. Now, the SCADA networks, where it's a lot more corporate-like, we're not seeing anywhere near 90%. But in these process control networks, especially the ones that use layer 2 protocols, like your GE turbines, those you're going to get a lot of duplicate traffic in that one. One of the other surprising things was the importance of good filters. We thought we could filter out based on VLANs or ports and avoid backup traffic and that sort of stuff. But the reality is when you've got a switched network like this, if you're getting backups, it's going to cross one of those switches that you're connected to. So being able to filter that traffic became more and more important as we were trying to narrow that traffic down to get a higher signal to noise ratio. Seeing the statistics and identifying if ports were down, that's an important one. I mentioned that earlier. One of the things that we've been able to get to just recently is, as we've gone through sensor upgrades, we've been able to actually specify smaller sensors. Initially, we went into this not knowing how much traffic we needed. So just to make sure that we had enough capacity, we ordered the larger sensors, and you end up paying for that, right? But with an aggregation layer, you can go in and actually filter out the data you don't need and save money on that sensors and analysis. And that's also helped us where we put in PCAP storage. So we've increased the amount of PCAP from hours in some situations to days, and in other cases it's a week or more that you're storing more data on the same amount of storage. So if you're going to store full PCAP, that filtering and the deduplication is critical. And the whole point of this, all of this, when we talk about gathering it, is so that your security operations team can focus more on the threat hunting, which is what they're supposed to do. So let's talk a little bit about optimization. So this is a little bit of a discussion about SIP 15 and where we were going as the drafting team for how to determine where you want to tap into your network, right? There's a lot of ways to do it. This is a legitimate diagram of a single unit at a generation facility. And so I want to talk through some of the details here about what you might want to look at. So first, you'd notice that there's sort of a core there on the left. And if you plug into that core, you're going to get 80 to 90% of the traffic, maybe more. In this particular network, you'd be getting 90% plus of the network. I don't think there's anything that you would miss with one connection the way this control system is designed. And really what you're looking at is that's an obvious first choice when you're going. But what you're looking at is, what are the protocols, right? Is this the layer 2 protocol? Is it a layer 3 protocol? If you haven't gone in and looked at it, you may or may not know the difference in how it operates. So if you look there at switch number 2, where there's an HMI and a PLC connected, if this is a layer 2 protocol, well, that PLC is going to be gathering a whole bunch of information, putting it on the wire and broadcasting it everywhere. And that HMI that's connected to switch 1, it's going to see all that traffic. You're not going to miss a thing in that network unless somebody sits down at the HMI in network 2 and does a layer 3 connection to the PLC. That's the only thing you'll miss with this one connection, right? If somebody from the HMI on switch 2 connects to the HMI on switch 6, you're going to see it. It's going to have to traverse the switch number 1. And so this is the easy button. Now, there hasn't been guidance that came out of the drafting team. We wanted to put some of that in place to say, how are our auditors going to be auditing this thing? So I want to get some of this information out, that this is a really good option, but you are going to have to work to explain it, right? If you're sitting down in a SIP audit and you've got a list of 6 switches here and you're connected to one, you might get an auditor that says, well, why didn't you connect to switches 2, 4, 5, and 6, right? 3 is obvious. There's only one device on that one. But the others, you might have a reason to do it. And then you start getting into conversations about how the protocol works, and how the operations. This is another thing that you'll need to talk about with your generation teams. Does anybody ever even use the HMI connected to switch number 5, right? They probably don't. In many cases, it's just an emergency HMI that they would only go out to if the whole rest of the network is shut down. Other than that, they may not even use it. I've seen these where the screens have been off and they never get turned on. So a lot of this is protocol, a lot of this is operations and how things are used. But if you want to go and you have port capacity, it may not be that much money or any more difficult to run connections everywhere, right? If you've got fiber runs going out to all these buildings and your switches can handle it, you can just press the easy button and say, let's just spend a couple $1,000s and run it, and then we don't have to spend the time justifying why we didn't run connections everywhere else. If you do this, you're going to have to deduplicate. You're going to have a lot of traffic, especially on those, like an EGD protocol, if that's how this works. You're going to be getting potentially 60 to 100 EGD broadcasts or multicasts per second. And that's a lot of data that you'd be sending at a sensor, and you'd be paying for that capacity rather than eliminating it with a aggregation layer that can deduplicate that traffic. So a little more cable runs, easier to explain if you go this route. Another option is you can say, well, rather than go to the core, let's go out to the access layer and only connect to switches 2, 5, 6, and 4 there. And this is a good one, right? So if you only go with the access layer, now you've got all the traffic. There's really no connections on switch number 1 except for that HMI. Anything it talks to, you're going to see in 2, 5, 6, and 4. You might miss a little communication from that PLC on switch 3 to 1, but you can start seeing that it depends on the protocol in terms of how you're going to connect these systems. So are spans sufficient for the visibility in the organization? What do y'all think? There's spans, there's application layer. Do you guys want to, I'm trying to find results on this. Do you see any results, Brent?
Yeah, so it looks like 31% said that they believe spans are sufficient, and 69% said that they don't believe it is. So far, we have only used spans port mirroring on switch devices. You know, I think we've tended to try to not put equipment in line for like a tap or something like that, and that's really just been about speed of deployment. It's not to say that it doesn't make sense in some scenarios. We just haven't done it yet. So.
Right. Well, but I also want to talk about, well, and you'll get into it, endpoints, right? That's, when you're looking at networks, I think spans can be really good. There's some pros and cons, and I think everybody needs to understand these for when you're having the discussions with your first audit when 15 goes live, that you might lose some data in the span. If you want to get 100% of that data and guarantee that you're not going to overrun the switch, you're going to need taps to be able to do that. Spans can get overrun if your switch processor utilization goes too high. It can drop traffic. But let's get into the endpoint. This is not required by SIP 15, but I think it's an important consideration.
Sorry, I think I think I'm back now. So just realized I'm chatting and no one's hearing me. So okay, cool. So yeah, we're going to talk about what we've learned deploying sensors, right? So I'm going to start out by just talking about the discussion that we often have when it comes to getting OT visibility. And Mark and I have kind of done the analysis looking at frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK for ICS and spent a lot of time going like, you know, what's the layers, what are the data sources that we want, right? And we've kind of laid this out on a plan for us that's kind of in an increasing maturity. And so, you know, network layer definitely is, you know, where we started at, and it made a lot of sense for a lot of reasons, right? And then we moved to, you know, we're moving to the endpoint layer where we can try to go after operating system logs and application logs and things along those lines. And the final frontier, although we've kind of played around with a little bit, is stuff like maybe tapping into Pi historian data or other data that, you know, might be of interest that's coming from the control network itself. And real quick, I know that a poll popped up there. So which option accurately describes how your organization prioritizes OT security? So if you get a second, please take a look and answer that. And we'll look at that in just a little bit here. But let me keep going here. So why network first? Why did we approach it? Well, through the analysis that we've done, if you follow the behaviors that are TTPs that are described on the MITRE attack for ICS, network definitely gets you a good enough coverage for being able to have the artifacts you would need to detect adversarial behaviors in your network, right? So it's a good starting point. But beyond that, because it is passive monitoring, it's no or limited impacts to operations, pretty quick to get started, and in most situations, relatively simple. It was pretty easy for Mark and I to walk in and work with the various folks at our different sites and work with the network teams and just say, hey, we just need to enable a port mirror, set us up a span, that sort of stuff, right? And being able to really tell them and tell plant managers and other site managers, like, hey, like, we're going to be here, we're here to help, we're not going to be impacting your operations, the reliability of your system. It started allowing us to build trust and relationships. When we set out on this journey, I have to say that a lot of our OT teams were kind of operating in a little bit more of a silo, and while they were aware of us, it wasn't like they were, reaching out all the time, but we began to show value as we started building this stuff out. We started to prove that we're not breaking things, we're actually truly passive monitoring, we're not affecting the reliability, right? And that we are going to work alongside the operational teams. Mark and I did not ever come in and just demand that things got done. We took the time to make sure that all the stakeholders at a particular site, understood what we were trying to deploy, and that we would work within what their comfort levels were, as far as, do we do a deployment during an outage window? Are they okay with us doing it during runtime? And it kind of varied from site to site. I think Mark may have mentioned, I can't remember, that sometimes it's maybe even bringing a vendor in to help validate our configuration, and that it won't create impacts or something like that, something along those lines, right? But ultimately, working with the operational teams instead of just coming in and saying we're security and we're going to do this, went a long way to lay the groundwork for future visibility efforts, right? Like, there's no way in the world we were going to get past network if we started creating problems or we were too difficult to work with. And that's been great. And I would encourage everyone, like, network, get it. Like, it's going to be a standard. You're going to have to with the NERC SIP stuff, but we firmly believe you don't stop there, right? And we are actively working towards the endpoint and control data. We really do feel like you're going to get, network's decent, but you're going to get higher quality visibility if you can get the right logs out of your endpoints, operating systems, applications, and control systems, right? But it's definitely more difficult to deploy, and you can't really say you're passive anymore, right? Because you're going to have some sort of centralized logging infrastructure. You're going to have to be actually maybe changing configurations on devices by enabling syslog or other logging agents or capabilities, right? Enabling those. Maybe it's even changing audit policies on a domain or something along those lines, right? And like I said, you're not really passive anymore. Your log data is literally flowing across the same wires that that the control network traffic is running on. So if there's any constraints there, with the networking infrastructure or anything like that, that could be potentially problematic, right? But where we've been able to get to so far, things that we've focused on, but kind of broke it down by different operating systems. Windows, we've been really focusing on trying to establish better domain audit policies so that we can get more out of the native Windows logs. We've actually been able to get Sysmon deployed, leveraging the Swift on security configuration as a nice starting point there. And the Splunk Universal Forwarder agent, obviously we're a Splunk shop, so we've been able to get that agent, which definitely gives us a lot more assurance as to how that data is being transported, and that it gives us better visibility to the quality of the logs, and the fact that the logs or verification of the logs are making it to where we're sending it, right? Linux, we've been able to actually get some audit D policies in place to go beyond just kind of like some of the standard Linux auditing going on. And once again, Splunk Universal Forwarder helps make sure we're hoovering up all the stuff that we need and getting that to our central location. And then on the firmware type of devices, hardware devices, trying to enable syslog where it's at. The challenge there is always going to be whether the vendor actually has any security relevant logs that you even want out of there. But we have been trying to use our centralized collection to not only support the security use case, but also trying to offer some of the operational logs that maybe they need for some IT kind of more technical troubleshooting, trying to also make sure that we're getting some of those things. So could be value in enabling syslog, even if there's not any security relevant stuff at the time. But hey, start demanding of your vendors that, if they're only going to enable syslog and it's not a Windows or Linux operating system, ask them to start building in security checks and security logs that you could work with, right? But like all of this came with a cost, and I mentioned a lot of them before, right? Working with an environment refresh project. So it's slow and steady. It's literally years to get some of these things rolled out, because we can't just like walk in and be like, hey, we're going to install this agent on all your systems as they exist today. Sometimes we have to wait for those refreshes when we can spend money on better specs for the equipment. If you rely on a vendor to implement a control system, many times they're going to charge you a lot for a pretty junky system, right? We've been able to work alongside the OT teams with some of subject matter experts from our IT teams as well, to help them leverage enterprise licenses and other things like that to get the end result of more robust, higher spec systems on the control system network, which leaves more headroom for security monitoring, security agents, things along those lines, right? And by doing it during environment refresh periods, it gives us the ability to actually be on site and have these things in place during our factory acceptance testing, our site acceptance testing, which allows us to literally prove to teams that the things that we're enabling are not going to create impacts before they go live, which just once again adds that additional layer of confidence in what we're doing, right? And then, like I mentioned, centralized logging infrastructure. Hopefully you have a SIM in place or something else. Obviously we're Splunk shop, but you have many different things. You just got to make sure that you are thinking about the architecture and strategy for how you get logs out of OT environments into wherever your centralized collection is. And along those lines, I don't think this is kind of the high level strategy that Mark and I have tackled when it comes to centralized logging, right? We want the communication flow to be outbound only from our secure systems, right? We're basically just going to be sending it to the collection point and allowing the collection point, to then get it to where we can do our searching from our search heads and everything like that. Real quick here, it looks like we have another polling question. I actively collaborate with my counterparts, network team if you're on the security side, security team if you're on the network side. Please take a second to answer that. All right.
Yeah, I finally figured out how to get the results. I have to answer the question.
Yeah, I couldn't get to I can't get to the results on the last one. I didn't get a chance to answer it since I was talking, but that's okay.
Yeah.
I'll
And let me jump in.
Yeah.
I started Victor asked a question about using Cisco ACI that I missed earlier. Cisco ACI is an interesting one. If you're not familiar, it's a fabric-based application-centric infrastructure that Cisco has, and it has capability of pulling PCAPs right out of the fabric and sending it out somewhere. I can't remember the name. The network guys have said it a few times, and I forget what it's called, but it's kind of like a plug-in or something to use. That's a really good option. If you're using ACI, you probably have top-notch network engineers, and they're going to be able to help you figure out exactly the right ways to get the data. We haven't seen it in operational networks. I imagine it'll hit first in control centers where you've got the better network engineers and the newer equipment. And it may be at some point in our lifetimes, we might see it in generation plants. I doubt we'll ever see it in substations. We'll probably see some of the like Schweitzer networking that goes out there when you're doing different sort of setups in substations. But yeah, ACI in a control center, you can get good traffic out of that.
Awesome, good question. All right, moving on here. So I threw this in here. This is an eye chart. I'm not going to be reading through this all. I just wanted to throw this in here because, if you're struggling with where to start, this is kind of a sample Windows audit policy for any environments you have that have an Active Directory domain. These are all things that you may consider enabling to get some really nice, robust, Windows native event logging going, right? Obviously, we also highly recommend Sysmon and, having like starting with the Swift on security configuration. That's always a good place to start. But, a lot of this is taken out of best practice frameworks. And, so give it a look over, compare what you currently have, and see if maybe there's something that you can improve upon. So, and then I'll throw one other sample that I have in here. If I get to the next slide, here we go. This is a sample, once again, starting audit D policy for Linux. Once again, iChart, not going to go over it all in detail, but if you are looking for something to start with, this is a sample, something you can start with. I'm sure that there's other ones out there on the internet that you could find. But make sure that you understand what the goal of each of these are, as I know that with any audit policies, the more stuff you turn on, you are going to potentially impact system performance. So just be aware of that, and that's part of what you gotta test out when it comes to endpoint logging. So, all right, let's see. Okay, so kind of moving on into some more stuff that we've learned. I think Mark and I set out on this journey thinking like, hey, we're going to get like one thing, or set things up like one way, and it's going to be a one size fits all. But I think the more and more we look at the differences between the different types of environments that we're working within, we realize that there's definitely some differences and maybe some different strategic focuses that we should put on the different environments. So, for example, things that Mark already mentioned this, that we've learned within more of like the SCADA environments, is we're seeing, less industrial protocols, less proprietary protocols, a lot more, HTTPS in use, where, actual encryption of communications, right? Which obviously that's going to hinder the ability to do some of that east-west network monitoring, unless you're going to actually decrypt the packets or something along those lines, right? So we're realizing that we want network there as kind of like that base layer, but that prioritizing endpoint and application logs are going to give us maybe what we're missing in some of that encrypted traffic, right? Meanwhile, we look at things like generation, and this is the stuff that Mark described earlier, where we find we're getting too much multicast with, within the control networks, right? And that's the whole reason why we've had to go to our deduplication strategy, right? So, on top of that, basically everything there is going to be an ICS or proprietary control system protocol, right? So network's going to still be extremely important, a lot less encryption going on there. But, we still have made strides to move towards enabling endpoint and application logs and control system logs and things along those lines, right? So finally, the last area, substations, I think Mark and I are still on the fence and trying to figure this out, because the big problem that we have with substations is just the scalability problem. And, it's funny, as we've talked to, probably folks on this call and other peers from other utilities, it's always in how you're going to solve the scalability problem, or whether you have a team large enough that can handle it, whether you're willing to spend the money to put a sensor at every single site, right? So we're still kind of, thinking this through. We do think that network collection is going to be really important for the substations, especially, at like head-end systems where, like the telecom teams are doing, control and maintenance from central locations and stuff like that. But I guess more to come on that. And, that's part of, back to what Mark was talking about, this is why you need to know your networks, think through your strategy for INSM, and kind of go like, how important it, are various intra substation traffic. Is it something that's going to be needed? Is it not? And I think that's going to be, something that's part of your risk analysis for your logging strategy.
And capabilities. But Andy asked the question about RSPAN. I mean, it would be great if we had the bandwidth from every substation to just RSPAN that traffic back to a central sensor at the head end, but they're not all going to be like that, right? Or
Yeah.
if we had an ACI or a fabric, like a Schweitzer software-defined network, where you can pick a port and bring it back. Am I right?
Yeah, and I was going to say for RSPAN, I think you're right? In a substation environment, it makes sense. Usually it's a single switch. RSPAN is not usually recommended when you're aggregating or collecting across multiple switches. I believe there are certain challenges that you come across when you configure that way. And then the other part of it is if you have VACLs in place, right, within your network segment, using the RSPAN in tandem with VACLs also causes challenges. So
Yeah.
I think the trick here is, yes, okay, sometimes spans can work, but you really have to check a lot of boxes and make sure you don't have, I mean, it's like drug interactions, right? Make sure you don't have those little things on the side. So it's always like, you know, something with that you can inadvertently miss, and it just makes it more challenging. So it's why, you know, I mean, we're a little biased, but we always say, you know, tap when you can, span when you can't, for that very reason, because you're creating more work, right? And all the cross checks you have to do to make sure, like, okay, is this a scenario where a span's okay?
Yeah.
Totally.
So
Yeah.
on the rare occasion it is, right? Like, as much as I don't like to admit it, on the rare occasion it is.
I can even add to that, once you decide, you have to go back and check, because things around that network or even within that network may change. Now, control system networks don't change a lot, but they do change. So even though if
Yeah.
you've made the decision to tap or span or whatever, that can't be a static decision that never gets looked at again over time.
Right.
That's right. Yeah, we've had situations in
Exactly.
which, you know, we've been able to add as things at the plant change during, once again, during refresh periods. We've even been able to add maybe you know, networks that we hadn't been able to get because they were too far away, and now somebody ran fiber, and now we can actually get some stuff, right? So things are changing. These environments, you know, thankfully are dynamic and trying to improve. So, oh, did I lose sharing my screen?
Yeah, I took it over. Did you have a slide left?
Yeah, I do. We still have a few more.
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize that. My bad.
No problem.
All right. Yeah, because we have
I
just
think it went away. I thought you stopped it.
Oh, okay. Maybe I accidentally clicked it, but that's okay. We'll keep moving on here. So last thing that Mark and I have been working on that just wanted to point out, as this is a nice lesson learned, is, you know, we've been moving towards sensor virtualization. You know, I think when we set out, we were like, hey, we're just going to, you know, buy the hardware sensors. And that's kind of where we started with the detection vendors that we were working with. But then we realized, you know, wait a minute, if we think about this more strategically, if we go virtual sensors and we instead focus on, you know, a virtualization stack, you know, a kind of really beefy box that can run ESX, you know, like maybe we have the ability to now deploy multiple sensors, which can help us in a variety of ways, everything from, you know, preventing vendor lock-in, or maybe rapidly deploying multiple tools to try out different vendors. Maybe it's even along the lines of what we were just talking about, how different environments have different tools that maybe you want, right? Having the ability to rapidly virtualize and move different sensors in and out is huge. Mark had mentioned PCAP, and you know, this has enabled us to also enable a PCAP storage at some of our sites, so which, you know, definitely is a huge operational win. And you know, you might end up using it for security after all. So in the end here, kind of, you know, the last section here we want to talk about is, you know, Mark and I were kind of reflecting, especially with SIP 15, all the stuff that he was on, you know, if we were to give advice to folks, you know, the folks like we asked early on, those that are, it's a work in progress that you haven't started yet, if we could do this over again, go back in time, you know, what would we maybe do different in light of the things that we have learned? So that's what we're going to talk about now.
So right off the bat, the one of the things we did well in some instances is company partnerships. Right? Andy's talking about being on the generation side. We've talked about EMS and some of those. The first call is the network team. If you've got a network team or somebody who understands networking at the plant in question, then that's your first call. They may already know how to do this. If they've got an ACI fabric in, you're probably several steps ahead, and people would have already thought about this in the design. But get that network team involved. If it's the control center, get your EMS support team involved as well. They're going to need to know, and that's going to help you not only with the INSM, but while you're there, go get that extra stuff that Brent talked about, right? Go get the endpoint logs. Don't do the minimum. You're going in here, go in and get those endpoint logs and find out, you know, if they have trouble with adding an agent to collect the endpoint logs on that server, buy them bigger servers, buy them bigger workstations, right? Do the things that you need to do in order to collect all those logs, and make that happen each time you go in. Every time there's an iteration or an upgrade, you have a huge opportunity to go improve the collection and the visibility that you have. When you're in substations, get your protection automation people involved, right? They're going to know, they've designed those systems, and they see it, and they'll know it better than you do right off the bat. Once you get those data feeds identified, you know what you're going to collect. Well, now it's time to start actually running cables. So this is where you're going to build your aggregation layer. And as Brent mentioned in that previous slide, it's a compute layer. I think the right way to do this is to own your own compute so that you can put your virtual sensors on it and collect This is where you're going to figure out port capacity needs, get your port mirrors or your taps or your ACI tags or whatever it is that you're going to need to put in place. This is where you actually install it and connect it out to your sensor. And then once you get your sensor installed, we think the third thing to do is to actually go learn that traffic. When you actually call Peter up, who's on the call, and you'll be hearing from him shortly with Myra, one of the first questions he's going to ask you is, what type of data are we looking at? How much data? What are the protocols in use, right? These questions inform the selection and how well Peter is going to be able to help you detect the traffic. So learn that data volume, get the data from your Keysight, or install an open source tool like INL Malcolm or Security Onion or something like that that's going to help you get that basic level of visibility so that you can then, I know my protocols. I know I've got layer 2 traffic. I know I've got this much layer 3 traffic. I know how many endpoints I have in general. They're not going to be 100% accurate, but you can then go to your vendors and say, this is what we need, and they're going to be able to help you faster. One of the things that we talked about when we were putting that timeline together that Patrick mentioned for SIP 15 that's given you 3 years and 5 years is that we're worried that the vendors may not have enough resources to go out and help all the utilities that need to implement. So if you can come in with better data, you're going to get better results right off the bat, even if it's just Wireshark, right? If you're collecting an hour of traffic and letting it run through Wireshark so you've got some answers, we think that's an important one. And then go talk to your vendors, right? Go find out who's got the best system for yours. We like Dragos. The big thing here is the priorities. We prioritized heavily threat behavior detection, right? This is, we were looking for that evil squirrel in the network. Far below that is baseline and asset identification. The way I say it, and I'm kind of sarcastic, but we can hire an intern to go out and figure out assets and build that asset spreadsheet. That's not my number one priority. The number one priority that I think we need to do as security professionals is to find adversaries in a network and be able to have that capability. Give the best capability you can to the SOC team that gets them the right data, the right tools, and to me, that's the most important thing. So once you get this done, you're well on your way to actually having the ability to choose the right tool that's going to match up to your environment. Anything to add, Brent?
No, I think that's it. So yeah, I guess I don't know if we have any time for questions right now, or if we just want to pass it on over to Peter and Myra.
Yeah, if you've got questions, throw them in. If not, then let's get Peter and Myra. I'm interested to hear the next part.
Yeah, do we have any other questions? I don't see any in chat, but please pop them in and we'll take a beat to cover them even while going through the next portion.
Nice hat, Peter.
Yeah, thank you.
This is Patrick. I can say
You guys see
without
my PowerPoint now?
yes, we do. But real quick, I wanted to add just thanks to SRP, Mark. Just not a lot of people are willing to show what they've done and give that story. So it's really, really good to hear. And I'm sure a lot of people have really appreciated that and got a lot of value out of it. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. We hope to give this presentation quite a bit and help as many as we can to shortcut the answers. But part of the discussion that we had in that SIP 15 is how do we get this clock ticking sooner so that more people can do it? We, in this industry, we need visibility, right? We need to be able to answer the questions that people are asking about attacks on this network. And this is the fast way to do it. Go plug the system in and start watching your networks.
Yeah, agreed. And I did like the point you raised around don't wait, get started. Not only will your hardware vendors run into some issues, we've seen, over the years, many different supply chain impacts on the hardware side. There may be software side impacts with everything from data breaches to other components that would impact even software availability to you, but also services. If you need people to rack and stack or configure or help you architect or even consult you on this, you and everybody else in the sector are going to be trying to do this all at the same time. So if you wait, you're going to get left with what you have available, which may be the most expensive and least skilled option. So just be mindful of that. And then, of course, understand that any catalytic event, I think is a good euphemism. If anybody gets hacked or anything severe happens that's either in or adjacent to our space, it's only going to accelerate our timelines. So having this expectation that, oh, it'll be a while till FERC adopts, and then I got 5 years, understand that is profoundly unrealistic. So, set your project plans accordingly.
100%.
Great advice, Patrick. With that, Peter, I think we'd love to begin with an introduction from you about Dragos and just a little bit on your background.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, so hi everyone, and it's great to see Mark and Brent here. So I'm actually, so my name is Peter Brownswell. I'm a senior solution architect here at Dragos. I've worked with Mark and Brent for many years now. I was actually in the electric industry myself. I was working for right around 8-9 years at an electric utility in Arizona, neighbor to SRP. And it's where I originally started talking to Brent and Mark, and we used to share threat intelligence. And that is one of the reasons why I really love the electric space, because we're able to share a lot with each other and help each other out. So I moved on from the electric utility to Dragos as an incident responder. I'm an incident responder by trade, security engineer. I've been in the seat of most of you trying to build out some of these programs, and just recently moved over to the solution architect to help out as much as I can. I absolutely love my job, going to talk with customers, seeing where they're at, and kind of looking at their maturity models and how we can help them with this overall monitoring strategy that they're going toward. So I'm really happy to be here and talk about everything we're going to go over today.
Yeah, great, thanks. And my name is Marisol Munn. I'm with Keysight, and I am part of the solutions team. So really, I focus on kind of how we can bring our solutions together with folks like Peter to really create a solution for customers like SRP that's kind of end-to-end versus a portion of it. So I think that really on our end, for Peter and I, it begins with, what are the challenges that are faced in managing OT cybersecurity? And with that, of course, we have a poll question about how confident you are in your organization's ability to detect security incidents in your environment promptly. And this will tie back into what Dragos offers and what Keysight offers and the solutions that SRP has deployed.
Yeah, and this is a really good starting point here. What we heard from Mark and Brent, some of the, and there's different priorities that every organization takes. But really at the end, trying to understand, what are the risks that are associated with you and your environment, and what are the threat, vectors that might exist that you might not be aware of. Really taking that view of, where is my data? What am I seeing? What do I have in my environment? Who's connecting to it? I've seen with my work with a lot of different customers that it's not uncommon to have vendors have persistent VPN access to a system in your OT environment because of contractual obligations to something that's going on in there. And in most cases, that some of my customers don't understand, what's that visibility like? Do we see that? When do they connect, and what do they do after? Which we've seen many times from a supply chain issue, right? That some vendors might get compromised, and somebody can use that as a conduit into that environment. But after that, what is it in your environment that really poses that big risk to you? And do you understand what those are and how to monitor those and try to mitigate some of these, right? Future threats, vulnerabilities that might exist, and do you have the adequate resources to tackle those, and enough data to actually prioritize some of those? So we at Dragos take a threat intelligence driven approach for a lot of this. So we're out there, looking at different adversaries attacking many different industrial verticals. So really, we want to make sure you have all the data that you need to be able to understand those risks and how to mitigate them.
Yes. And then with that, I mean, I think we go back to, you're making sure they have all the data to mitigate those risks and address the threats. But to do that, we basically go back to our aggregation layer, right? So I love this slide from Mark and Brent, right? The problem solved with Keysight. They cover a few of the key problems, and I'd like to highlight, just some of the nuances of of how we actually help them address the solutions, because as you heard from Mark, that they'd actually use a switch solution initially, which didn't quite meet the needs. And then we can kind of cover how Keysight differentiates from a lot of what you'll get offered either in your basic switching or in simple solutions that as we're seeing networks mature and OT and IT converge, right? OT has maybe the pro and the con. You have the benefit of seeing what IT has already done in the OT space because they've had years to kind of develop some things, and there's some learnings and some best practices and some things that can be extrapolated over, but it's not exactly the same. So there's a little bit. I think the unfortunate side of it is IT had many years to evolve into it. Whereas OT, kind of once the floodgates open, you're facing the hockey stick, right? It's going to be a hockey stick of both regulations as well as the data that's going to eventually hit your networks, right? Right now, maybe a handful of things are coming online in your control systems or in the Purdue model, right? Where we're grabbing stuff from Access. But as more and more devices come online, the polling increases, the volume increases, just the sheer everything increases, right? You're facing a lot more challenge from that point of view, whereas IT was allowed to evolve with it over time. In particular, you know, we call out that getting the right data to the right feed. So this is back to Mark's comment about the right filters. So, you know, just setting up a handful of filters or using VLANs, yeah, in a very simple setting can be sufficient, right, with our spans or just span ports. But as soon as you get, you know, one level beyond that, you need something a little more sophisticated. So to that end, our solutions aren't just a, you know, filter A to B. We have what we call the patented dynamic filter compiler, and it's really just it's a safety net. That's the best way I can describe it. It's a safety net for customers to ensure that when you set up filtering, that everything else that you maybe didn't specifically call out or data that you didn't specifically consider, oh, the overlaps of, okay, well, A goes here and B goes here. Well, what happens to the combination of A and B and all the Venn diagrams? Our filter compiler basically automates that. And there's sort of a catch-all at the end of it. So say you set up some rules and then something gets left out, right? We catch that. If you do it with CLI, that's not automated. It's very human dependent and it creates an overload for your team. Well, yeah, one more thing to remember. And by automating that, we make life a little bit simpler. The other big one is deduplication. So when we move away from spans to taps, right, we go from not having enough data or the risk of missing data to sometimes having more data than is needed or duplicates of the same data. So deduplication is something that we really bring up often in the sense of it's okay if you grab excess data, right? There's always a concern, well, what if I have too much data, I overload, you know, or the sensor can do it. If each sensor does it, right, or each receiving end solution does it, it's a lot of work. To do it centrally and distributed is more efficient, and we offer that. And I'll chime in here. Historically, this is where I would advocate against speaking about how we construct these, but because it's so big in the media lately, it's worth a deviation. We do our deduplication in either patented technologies now or in FPGAs. Historically, FPGA wasn't something you'd commonly bring up, but thank you, NVIDIA, for making it a household term at this point. And we've been using FPGAs in our packet brokers for over a decade. It just shows that we understood where the data was going and that we knew that you would need that high compute to really address this challenge, right? As you're grabbing more and more data and you want to efficiently streamline it so you're not overloading the recipient tools, because last thing we want to do is send Dragos extra stuff, right? Just like junk in, junk out, overload isn't really sufficient. We want them to get everything, but still not too much of it. So then they can give you the right alerts and guidance to be able to actively address. And then the third topic I'll bring up is we brought up CLI and missing aspects of the data in setting up filter rules and manually having to remember that. For that, we're the first in our space to actually go to drag and drop. And I've got a small screen capture on the right here, but it's literally drag and drop. On the left side, you have your ports. In the center, you have your filters. And on the right side, you have your egress. You literally drag and drop. So say that I'm busy, someone else comes in, or, you know, staff turnover happens. You expand your team, someone gets promoted, a variety of things. Anyone can kind of hop in and easily see visually where the ports are going, but also you don't need a CLI expert to do a lot of things. We are still CLI enabled, where if you want to set up some custom things, you can, but it's not our primary facet. So it makes it easier to manage. And as the number of things that our teams, both in our IT organization, because we hear this internally too, as well as in the OT and IT teams that you guys have, depending on what your organization is. But for the most part, any organization that is internet connected has this challenge, right? We're being asked to do more with less continually. And by not requiring folks to dig into the weeds, we really facilitate that scale of people and the ability for folks to feel like their jobs are a little bit easier to do. I know I believe it's in Brent's slides that we showed that we were using the E10S, which is one of our lower speed but complex packet brokers. As you can see, we have a full portfolio. Just a quick look at that we have sort of everything across the gamut on the top end that can do more complex things with FPGAs. And down here, we have sort of the series that covers more aggregation and filtering. And so we are flexible in what we offer different organizations to meet their specific needs. And in terms of just moving to collecting and optimizing, right? Yeah, I think the way we always joke sometimes about product marketing, but I think Brent and Mark naturally did it, right? They showed you 3 formats of how you could access the data, right? And I almost felt like, okay, yeah, that's a good, better, best solution, right? There's a good solution where you're connecting up front, but you got to be ready to explain it to your auditor what you're doing and how you're doing it, right? The better solution is, hey, this is sort of the middle ground. It's less expensive than the best solution, but it's pretty good. You get most of what you need and you save a little cost. And then the best solution is the one I didn't show the screen capture of, but you know, it's kind of like do everything. But then of course we know when you get to do everything, it's financially not the best option, right? Because in the end, we are all businesses as well, and funds are not unlimited. So in terms of accessing data, right, we do also offer quite a bit in how you can access the data. This again is presented in flexible forms depending on what your organization needs. And to that end, I know in a lot of these cases, you guys are moving out to substations to access the data. And I know that in substations, his legacy IT electronics will not succeed because they'll melt or catch fire or possibly both, to be honest. So we do have a series that target substations and a lot of the things that utilities are dealing with that traditional IT or say a healthcare company just wouldn't have. And we're flexible in opening ourselves to that space and working with our counterparts like Dragos to create the right solutions that really fit. So we grab all that data and Peter, you know, we hand it to you, much like I'm gonna do now with the mic.
Yeah. So, and one thing I want to kind of cover, and I know we've highlighted here some of the priorities that SRP mentioned earlier. But really, when we look at any of these for an overall monitoring strategy to be successful, is you know, making sure we have quality data. Number one, going into the and this is any monitoring solution, right? Whether it's Dragos or any open source tool or anything that you're using. Making sure you have quality data going in. And I've seen many times when I'm working with different customers, again, different variations of maturity, where you might have somebody just spanning directly from a switch, maybe doing some R spanning or tapping somewhere else. But very often we see that, you know, the amount of flooded data, especially in the OT space where there's not a lot of segmentation that's being implemented or it's getting there. Making sure you have the ability to filter out some of that information to get the data that you want and filter out anything that's not going to be meaningful for your OT monitoring strategy is key. So this is where, you know, working with companies like Keysight and the technology that they have and being able to do that makes it a very effective way to get that data. Because at the end of the day, right, the goal is to reduce the mean time to detection and response, and really taking a look at what you have going in and how fast can you respond to and how well your coverage is, which is amazing to hear. Again, all the work that Mark and Brent did with Keysight to make the solution there more cost effective, which means they can expand their coverage easier without, you know, taking a big hit on their budget. So very great. But on these priorities that they took from a threat behavior standpoint, this is where we play well, right? For us, one of our differentiators is our threat intelligence driven approach. We're really trying to look at this data and then figure out, why would this matter to you? What's important about this? We have our own intel wing that we basically go and look at 20 plus adversaries targeting the industrial space, figuring out how they're doing this and how they're performing their activities. And then this is where getting that data into the platform and looking at it to give you that quality data analytics on it is key. So, do we have another slide?
Yeah. We have a couple of use cases after this,
Yeah. So this is for us, our typical use case kind of library. When customers reach out to us, this is the area where you're going to see the biggest benefit from leveraging a tool like ours and getting that quality data from someone like a Keysight, right? For us, like asset visibility and vulnerability management, again, everybody has different priorities in what they're doing. We usually have people come in and say, I want to know what's in my network. What do I have in there? I don't know what exists in that environment, who's talking to what. But these are, great starting points. But the threat detection and also incident response, investigation, and help with that, right? You can leverage our tool to collect PCAPs for the forensics, or go through some of those analytics that we've built out so that you don't have to go try to build these out on your own. You have that latest and greatest threat intelligence leveraging in your platform. And from the vulnerability management, doing that passive collection in your OT environment so we're not interacting with anybody, and looking at that data to give you, here's the vulnerabilities that you should care about, and prioritizing those in a now, next, or never type priority is where we really differentiate and help. Next slide. Yeah, then again, just talking overall ecosystem for us, Dragos platform, which is a tool that Brent and Mark were talking about that they're deploying in their environment and feeding it data. That's kind of core and center to everything we do. But we do have a threat intelligence wing that again tracks all this adversary group, gets all that information baked into the platform so that you can leverage that automatically, right? Just all the data that gets pumped in goes through those analytics. And we also have a team of OT experts all over from our intel side, from our professional services side, that are really taking on some of those that knowledge that they have and baking it in the form of playbooks that you can leverage, or even other services, right, to help you with architecture reviews. Where do we place these sensor placements, cybersecurity assessments, et cetera? So.
Yeah, we have a number of use cases where, Keysight, Dragos, we fit together to provide sort of, everything from data capture to actually your threat and your analysis and your IDs. I stole SRP's picture, right, showcasing electricity and water, but we've also deployed similarly and have similar application for customers in oil and gas, where Keysight does TAPAG and Dragos does the threat detection, asset ID, and vulnerability management, and then also in manufacturing. This is where, IMES systems are now becoming connected to the internet, whereas historically they've been offline completely, or there's IoT devices now sort of, being connected. And so they're dealing with similar but not the same challenges. And we're providing solutions that, provide some of the TAPAG, but also maybe remote site tunneling. And Dragos is again receiving and providing the threat detection, asset ID, and vulnerability management to ensure they're able to enact upon it as they're bringing all these items online as part of their OT becoming connected to the internet. With that, I will stop sharing and we will move to open Q&A, in which case the idea is that we can actually unmute folks. If you raise your hand, you'll get unmuted and you can join the discussion live. And if you don't want to do that, you're still able to put your questions into chat and we'll address them across the panel. So questions could be for anyone, everything from Kareem, Patrick, Brent, Mark, Peter, myself, or even beyond that.
Or we can just catch up with Peter and Patrick and hang out.
Myra, we have Scott Stoner is added to the group.
Hi, Scott.
Right.
Welcome.
Wow.
Scott, do you have a question or a topic you'd like to address?
I don't see him. I don't see him on the list. I think
What
somebody's
if
there.
just hit the wrong button and hung up?
We'll
He was
see.
here earlier.
Yeah, I saw him.
That's out at MPPD. They're one of our APPA partners, public power.
I don't see Scott anywhere.
Yep. No, I don't either.
Did he get bounced when we added him?
Possibly.
Okay. Maybe it'll just take a minute for him to come back on. In the meanwhile, anyone else want to hazard a try? We either will hear you or you might get bounced out. You know, one of the two.
Yeah, this is Kareem. Maybe one question for the team is regarding the earlier in the discussion, Patrick. You were kind of showcasing the SIP evolution and the many iterations and velocity of all the SIP changes. Maybe a question for SRP here regarding the implementation or I'm going to call it the absorption of these changes. How often do you regroup as a team to implement these changes? What kind of, I'm going to call it stress this is causing on your implementation? And what kind of activities, is it weekly, daily, monthly? You have to kind of regroup, reassess, maybe do some updates into your kind of visibility and security architecture. What is the frequency of this just based on what you've been doing and the changes that are being implemented?
So I don't know, Mark, if you want to take some of this, but I mean, I think in general, like, it depends upon the nature of the SIP changes, right? The way we kind of have shall we call it like a decentralized model for when it comes to some of the NERC SIP compliance. So we've got responsible departments that are responsible for implementing certain ones. So, it's going to depend upon the nature of the SIP changes. But once we receive, an announcement about what changes are coming, those responsible departments will look at their own processes to kind of figure out how they might need to adapt. If it's simple for them just to make small tweaks to what they're currently doing, then, problem solved. If it's something that's going to warrant a larger, kind of collective approach, we do have an ERC, what are they, energy reliability compliance group or whatever. Anyway, so they might help coordinate and facilitate a larger gathering of responsible departments to address those things. And then, when it's like something that's more of like an architectural change that will need to come out of the standards, like I would argue that potentially the INSM one would be something that would have constituted a larger architectural change within our environments had Mark and I not already been ahead of the curve. Then we might drive it, or once again, ERC might drive it with the various responsible departments and get us involved to help try to kind of figure out what that strategy is going to look like. But, I wouldn't say that, like, I think we have enough upfront notice that I don't feel like we are reacting, and like, I don't feel like there's chaos or stress necessarily, at least within the way that our program runs. I feel like, we kind of had already been working towards the INSM stuff, for years. So, this one really isn't creating any major headaches for us. I think we're already in alignment with what that standard is going to call for. I don't know, Mark, anything else you want to add on that?
No, that's exactly it. It's I'm dead.
Okay.
Thank you, Brent.
Myra, we have Brian Downs added to the group.
Hi, Brian. Welcome. Are you able to unmute?
Yeah, now I can. I didn't actually have a question. I was just worried that other people may have had questions, but they didn't. They had no way to reach out to you.
Oh, I love it. The voice of the people.
Well, Brian.
So you know what? Scott put his question in the chat. It seems that we're still a little bit struggling on our tech interoperability with Mac. But I'll read it out loud while Well, they're still working it out. Dawn has provided some very detailed instructions for Scott. But Scott said, can you expound on the disadvantages of using RSPAN in an environment with multiple switches sending span traffic up to an aggregation switch and then to the sensor?
I think the primary disadvantage, Myra, you may be good. I guess from my standpoint, it's bandwidth. What do you think?
No, I think that's part of it. You know, I think the second part of it is just the ability to filter and kind of know what you're getting out of your multiple switches, right? So when you're bringing it all in, now it's going to be a question of, okay, where's it coming from? Where do I need to look, right? If you're coming from one span, it's easy. As you add multiples and you no longer have the ability to kind of figure out where it's coming from, what it's doing, or lose a little bit of that transparency, you're losing some of the data fidelity that helps you figure out what's happening.
Yeah, it's a good one. You can't
Yeah, I think
the other.
Oh, sorry.
Another compliance consideration is when you RSPAN, you've got to have routable connectivity to send that across. And so now you can't have that system as a not ERC compliant system when you do it. If you're in an EMS and everything's already behind your EAP, probably not a consideration. In a generation plant, that might be a bigger consideration there.
Peter?
Yeah, I think a couple we've seen, you know, with different deployments that we've gone into, the traffic CPU utilization, because as you're kind of going through the different switches, that added bandwidth can really impact CPU performance, and also just looking at the deduplication of data, duplicated data as it goes across, because now you're seeing traffic through different switches that goes out. But we've seen that just add to the complexities of getting that data where you need it.
Thanks, Peter. All right. I don't see another question in the chat, but there was a poll question that I wanted to kind of hop onto. I wanted to talk about the budgeting one. So we had one about how your organization prioritizes OT security, and the options were, you know, how do they pick? And it was either, you know, audit, cost, and then the human effort to implement and execute. And then B was cost/audit, and then the human effort to execute, and then flips of all those. And the top two, well, the top one, which is not surprising, is cost is number one. And then followed by audit and compliance, and then finally support and time to effort. And I guess I really kind of want to hear from those who have maybe responded to this question to say, you know, how it seems that all of our organizations are cost sensitive, right? I think it's sort of a thing that we're seeing across all industries everywhere. So with costs being so high, what are some of the things we've used, or what are some of the things that you've used, or maybe some areas that are a challenge in terms of convincing the organization that the cost of doing some of these things to put OT security and compliance in place is worth it, right? Obviously, when NERC mandates it, or when you get with a fine, you do it. But how do you enable your organization to move forward? And Mark, Brent, maybe you can kick that off, right? You guys are ahead of the curve here. How did you convince your management?
Well, I think they convinced us.
Okay.
I mean, it kind of feels backwards on this one. Essentially, what happened that started this off is we went in and gave a presentation about what happened in Ukraine 2015 and 2016 to our risk oversight committee. And we thought they understood the difference between monitoring in the IT network and monitoring in the OT network. But when they hear monitoring, they're thinking crown jewels, right? They heard we've got Splunk, we've got this, we've got EDRs, we've got all these sorts of things, and they're like, oh, you know, everything's great, but there's this air gap, and they hadn't really understood the difficulty and the differences between IT and OT. They wanted us to get past it. So the way I like to say it is that we gave that presentation. It was clear that they thought we were monitoring OT at the same level as IT, and we sort of reset their expectation of what it was happening. And they very quickly came back and reset our expectation that they expected us to monitor OT. And it was from the highest levels in our instance. And I guess the way I look at it from a cost perspective is that when the executives understood risk, when they were asking the question, are we vulnerable to that attack? And we had to be able to give them an answer. And when we gave that answer in terms of risk, cost was secondary or tertiary. It literally became a non-issue. Because, I mean, if you've ever seen the contracts with like a GE turbine for a series of power plants, this is not that expensive in relation to generating power, right? This is a small component from the way they look at it. And if they can take the whole thing and buy down that risk, I think they'll do it. You just have to be able to explain to them, get somebody who really is good about talking about risk and get that in front of your risk oversight committee. This was originally the people who look at fuels, right? So they're looking at fuel costs 5, 10, 15, 30 years out, and how are they going to hedge that? So they're dealing in the billions of dollars. And when we come in and say, hey, we're looking for, 6 figures to 7 figures, and they're like, why are you bothering? Why isn't this done already? That was the impression they got. So I think it's tell a story. I'd be happy to share that slide deck. It wasn't anything big, right, Brent? You talked 2015 and I talked 2016. We both went out and researched exactly how those attacks occurred, and they asked the right question, which is, can that occur here? And if it does occur, will we spot it? And the answer to that second question was definitely, well, we'll see it when it comes through the corporate network, but beyond that, we didn't have the visibility. So they reset our expectation, and we've been working on that ever since.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that because totally agree with Mark's approach and kind of how they took it. I remember seeing them kind of go through some of this process, and for us, very often we have that conversation with customers. It's all tied back to risk. What is the risk associated with the threats that are impacting your organizations, and do you understand the threats that are impacting your organization, right? But really tying it back to take that consequence-driven approach to your environment, right? If something were to happen, if we got these adversaries, like in Mark and Brent's case, they used the study on the 2016 attack. There's a lot of those different types of attacks that have happened that have targeted different areas. Ransomware is a big risk to a lot of organizations. And I think that question is, how do I address that risk? And do we have the visibility? Do we have the security? You look at your whole security ecosystem. Do we have the coverage, and how effective is that coverage to be able to mitigate those risks to the environment? And if you're having those conversations with your leadership, I think that makes the cost conversation a little bit easier to have. Properly addressing risk to your in a lot of the industrial spaces, safety is first and foremost. Do we have anything that could impact safety, and how would we mitigate that risk to our organization, and what tooling can we put in place to detect, take that consequence-driven approach to your crown jewels?
I think that's a great outcome, right? One of the things that we could sort of follow up with is maybe the best practices and how to properly evaluate your organization's risk in this space, because it's a little newer, right? So some of the examples are different, and I think, like you said, 2015, 2016 examples created information for you guys to use. But
and I'll add on top of that, we actually did conduct we basically did a red team exercise that basically simulated the exact sort of things that happened in Ukraine events, right? Like to try to kind of figure out, like, what did we have detections for, where could we see, where the lines were and all that, and obviously knowing that our setup wasn't exactly the same, it still allowed us to kind of get a SRP specific version of what it could look like, and kind of figure out a better understand where our gaps were in visibility and in controls, right? So, and that, once again, all of that going to an executive committee, if you've got that top-down governance for your security program, it means a whole lot. It gave us so much leverage. But I have to say, Mark and I weren't jerks about it. Like, we could have walked into Lysaria and said, hey, we got top-down support, you're going to be doing this. We still treated it as if we were trying to kind of grow it from kind of the ground up, and make sure that we got buy-in with various managers and site supervisors and all that. We I think that was really important. We weren't jerks about it, even though we had this kind of objective, like that was coming down from on high, right? But you know, but it gave us a lot of leverage, and like we said, it definitely made cost decisions very easy. Our manager has always had a really good stance. You know, he doesn't want money to ever get in the way of making a good security decision. And granted, you got to balance that with a calculated business risk, understanding of business risk, right? And you got to weigh that out. But thankfully, with our governance structure, we have the ability to have those conversations and make sure that if the right decision means that we need to put some money into it, then we can take it to the right level to hopefully clear those hurdles.
Yeah. Well, Mark, Brent, thank you for sharing your experience and learnings, and Patrick, thank you for your guidance in NERC and SIP, and thank you everyone for attending. Nick has put a beautiful quote for me to close out with. He said, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So let us know how we can help you measure it, and wishing you all the success with your organizations and your OT security deployments. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.